In that case, welcome to the Planning Committee meeting this evening. And may I first of all welcome Maidstone's newest political party to this their first meeting of the Planning Committee. Gentlemen, ladies. Right, we have a number of apologies this evening. So far, I have apologies from Councillor Brian Clark, Councillor Mrs Stockel, Councillor Brian Vizard and Councillor Martin Cox. Are there any others? No, that's everyone then. Item 2, notification of substitute members. I'll start with Councillor Perry.
Yes, Councillor Perry for Councillor Mrs Stockel.
Councillor Hastie.
Councillor Hastie for Councillor Clark.
And Councillor Brian Mortimer.
For Councillor Cox, thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. We move to notification of visiting members. I see Councillor Mrs. Do that when he arrives. Well, he's not here, is he? Well, if he arrives, Councillor Willis will be substituting for Councillor Clark, I believe. But I didn't announce that. Because he isn't currently here. We shall see. Right. Notification of visiting members. I see Councillor Mrs. Sams. Which items, please? Thank you very much. That's 14 and 15 for anyone who didn't hear. Items withdrawn from the agenda. I'm not aware of any, and I hope there aren't any. Otherwise, we won't have anything to talk about. So there aren't any. Date of the adjourned meeting. There won't be one, I hope. Item 6. Any business the Chairman regards as urgent, including the urgent update report as it relates to matters to be considered at this meeting. We have a very short urgent update report, which I direct members' attention to. It's literally one page. We move to disclosures by members and officers. I believe we have at least one disclosure this evening. Councillor Mrs. Prendergast.
I'd like to declare an interest in agenda item 16. The applicant is, despite everything, still married to me, so I will leave the room when that item is being considered. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and we commend the individual concerned for his bravery. Item 8, disclosures of lobbying. We will take those with a particular application. Item 9, to consider whether any items should be taken in private because of the possible disclosure of exempt information. We do have an exempt appendix, which we probably won't need to discuss, but if we do, it will be taken as a Part 2 item. All the rest of the agenda will be taken in public as notified. Item 10, minutes of the meeting held on the Ides of March 2018. Has everyone read the minutes? So can we agree they're an accurate record? Thank you very much. I'll sign those later. Presentation of petitions, if any. I'm not aware of any petitions. So that's deferred items. Have we any update on the deferred items on page 7 and 8?
No further update this time, Mr. Chairman.
No update. Right, so we move on to the agenda. I will take item 3 first, as there are no speakers on it. Might get it out of the way, if any, and if people don't wish to speak to it. That's 3 Orchard Place, Chartway Street, Sutton Valence. Does anyone particularly wish this introduced? You do. In that case, we will proceed with the agenda as set out. We move to item 1, and which is, the first item on the agenda, which is item 14, page 15 of the agenda. Clearly, this and the application following it overlap to a certain degree. So I would ask people who are speaking to both to try and not... James, come in and sit down quickly, otherwise you won't be able to take part in this discussion. I will give Councillor Willis a moment to take his seat. Right. Thank you. As I was saying, as there is something of an overlap and the same speakers, I would ask people, even if they do speak twice, to not repeat their remarks. So, just in time, I turn to the officer to introduce the first of the two reports on those applications.
Thank you, Chair, and good evening, members. Tonight, we've got the first item we're going to deal with is at Gibbs Oast Pilgrims Way in Lenham. It's an application for a barn, which is, we're looking at an agricultural barn, which is plot 7. It's an agricultural barn which is 8.8 metres high and approximately 450 square metres. Members will be aware there's a second application following item which is known as plot 8. And as we work through the papers, you will also be aware that there's been actually 6 other applications which have been submitted on the same site for a series of other barns. All those applications were actually refused on the grounds of the impacts on the AONB. And if members look at the urgent update, we've attached one of the copies of the decision notice there, which sets out the ground of refusal, which is identical for all 6 sites. So we'll just move on to the next slide. Okay. This is Gibbs Oast farm here, and the application site is here. The 2 barns in question are going to be sited sort of down in the sort of southeast section of the site. Just sort of give you some sort of parameters of the site and what we're dealing with. To the north of this is Pilgrims Way here, is the area outstanding natural beauty. So the actual corner of the plot down here is actually at the southern boundary. This is sort of, as I mentioned, this is Pilgrims Way along the bottom here, and then the lane going up the side along the east, that's Flint Lane, and that sort of goes up on top of the Kent Downs OMB. There's also a number of public footpaths which cut across the site or in the local area. There's one coming across here in sort of west to east direction. There's also one that goes through the farm site and then runs up, again up onto the top of the downs. The land to the south of the site is, you've got the Marley works here, and that's actually outside of the area of standard natural beauty. There's also a landscaping belt which sort of screens the sites along here, and sort of really when you're in this part of the site here, you can't really see the Marley work because of the substantial landscaping screen. There is actually a listed building on the site as well, or adjacent to site, albeit 150 metres away, and that's sort of Marley Courts here, which is a Grade 2 listed building. There's a series of sort of modern agricultural buildings which sit in this part of the site here. And in terms of the actual access into the site, there's an existing access which sort of just comes off where you've got the little triangle here by the junction. It just sort of pops in through here, and I'll show you a slide in a moment. Okay. Okay, this is sort of standing just by the access, looking north. So this is where we've got Flint Lane running up the side here. So this is the eastern boundary of the site. So there's a certain amount of landscaping, and you start to get a feel of the AONB as it sort of rises up. This is standing by the axis, looking in sort of a north-west direction. Look, obviously part of the AONB is up here, and these buildings we can just about make out, and these sort of buildings here is all the sort of farm buildings, and the modern agricultural buildings are sort of sited at the rear part of the site here, and they're actually sort of been dug in the ground slightly as well to sort of minimise its impact. And this is a view looking more sort of directly north of the site. Again, looking up onto the downs, and I think as I've mentioned before, there's a footpath which sort of runs along the crest of this sort of area here. This is sort of looking into the sort of the corner of the site where the building plot 7 is due to go, and this is sort of just highlighting there's a landscape in here, and as I said, the Marley works is behind there, but because of the existing, this landscaping site screen within the existing site is about sort of 3 to 4 metres deep. and then you've got Pilgrim's Way just beyond, and then the landscaping Marley site is sort of about 10 metres deep. And this is sort of standing up the axis, looking back down towards Pilgrim's Lane, Pilgrim's Way, sorry. So this is sort of Flint Lane, and this next photo is the actual access into the site. And also, I think because we had 8 applications, unfortunately, we had to display 8 site notices, which is, I think, ideally, we probably should have just condensed them, maybe put into one, because I've seen they will come down. That's okay. So again, you sort of can see the farm buildings sort of just to the rear of the site as well. The actual buildings themselves, or plot 7 in terms of the building we're looking at, in terms of this one, will be sitting about 25 metres set back from this axis here, so it's sort of going to be a bit further back, and then it's sort of in this area here. So sort of the views sort of looking out this way, you'd still see the downs, but obviously looking that way, you're going to catch your eye on the building. Right. In terms of this site plan, this shows what the applicant had originally envisaged with the site. We're looking at plot 7, which is this building here. And plot 8 is the next item on the agenda. And then all these 6 plots here are the ones we've refused the applications on in terms of the impact of the development. We also, and it's, in terms of the access, that's where it is at present. And there's an existing landscaping strip here, which is about sort of 3 to 4 metres. And members will see in the urgent updates, we're actually looking to put on, enhance that landscaping strip to sort of make it sort of 10 metres deep in terms of along here, around here. And then as part of the condition is to put the landscaping to the north and west rather than being along this boundary here, because this is where these buildings are. We're looking for it to be brought in tighter in terms of these buildings, so more likely around this area here, but that would be subject to a condition, because the last thing you particularly want is to put the landscape in here and then there's a big gap, and in terms of views across, you'd still be able to see it. So I think we're trying to bring the landscape a bit closer to the building to sort of minimise its impact. And then in terms of actually what the building looks like, it's a fairly sort of typical agricultural building in terms of sort of steel frames, with a sort of cement fibre-based sort of roof. And in terms of the actual assessment and this application, the site clearly lies in an area of sound attributed, which members are aware in terms of the officer's reports. Obviously aware that it will have an impact on the area of sound attributed, that's without doubt. And obviously when we consider applications affecting area of sound attributed, the fact it's an area of sound attributed holds great weight, and we have to sort of show that actually there's a overriding sort of justification for moving away from our recommendation in terms of the impact on the R&B. And I think with this case, there really was a significant impact on the area of sound attributed when there was an application for 6 additional barns on the site. And I think we felt that was too much, and we felt actually on balance, we feel that there's having this one and the next item on the agenda would be justified in terms of the economic need, in terms of the need of the farmer in terms of providing storage for their hay and outdoor machinery, which is sort of currently stored outside. And I think as part of balancing the harm to the AONB, we've looked at the enhancements that can be achieved through quite substantial landscaping belts in terms of sort of at least 10 metres along the north, the west, the east and the south boundaries. There's also an additional condition as part of the urgent updates, which includes a biodiversity enhancement condition in terms of it could be in terms of bat box or bird boxes, additional information to be supplied. Okay, so that sort of really runs through what our recommendation is today. I refer members to the main papers, the urgent updates, and obviously the recommendation is to approve. Thank you very much, Chairman.
Thank you very much. I'll now ask the legal officer to just briefly explain how the public speaking works this evening.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. As you've just heard, when we get to an item on the agenda, first the officer introduces the report and the chair then opens the matter up for registered public speakers. When you are called, please come forwards to the table in the middle of the room and press the middle button on the microphone. The tip of the microphone will turn red. You don't need to press the middle. You don't need to hold the middle button down. Simply ensure that it goes red and then start speaking. You will have 3 minutes to speak and you will see your time counting down on this screen here. Once your time is up, the chairman or I will alert you and you can stop at that point. Once you've finished, please press the middle button again. The microphone will turn white and then return to your seat. You may hear some of the speakers referred to as visiting members. They are members of the council, but they don't sit on this committee. They also have 3 minutes to speak, but they have no right to vote on any of the applications. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, I received a request from Councillor Walmsley. Is he here? Yeah. To speak this evening. There appears to have been some communication issue, whether it was at our end or at the Parish Council's end, I don't know, but I will be allowing him to speak on this item and the second one if necessary. Now, our first speaker is Mr. Smith. If he's here and object, if you'd like to come forward, sir, and press the grey button. Mr. Smith. Oh, Mr. Councillor Walmsley.
My name is Graham Smith. I'm here to represent the Ramblers. First of all, I'd like to remind us of what we're considering here. The application refers to the erection of 2 agricultural barns. Each of these barns is approximately 70 feet long by 28 feet high, and 2 are placed adjacent to each other, making a 100-foot long building, steel framed and metal clad, effectively a large industrial building to be placed in a sensitive rural environment. As the Ramblers, our main objection is to its effects on public rights of way. And the effect of a development on a public right of way is a material consideration in the determination of planning applications. This is detailed in DEFRA Rights of Way Circular 1/09, Section 7.2. Although this development does not encroach on or require the diversion of any existing public rights of way, it will have a seriously detrimental effect on the amenity value of the 2 closest routes. These are the Pilgrims Way and North Downs Way, which both run along the road alongside it, and public footpath KH287, which is a very good through route from Harrietsham up to the top of the Downs. The proposed development is declared to be intended to service other farming operations in addition to the immediately adjacent one. This will require significant additional heavy-duty traffic along the Pilgrims Way, which is clearly inadequate to accept such traffic. If the road was upgraded to accept it, it would then still be unsuitable for use as a public footpath. We also object to the encroachment into the North Downs area of outstanding natural beauty. The only developments permitted within farms in these areas are supposed to be those that relate to the farming requirements of the farms in that area. This development is clearly aimed at servicing operations at the applicant's other operations throughout Kent and beyond, and this clearly contravenes planning guidelines. And finally, I'd like to repeat my initial statement that this is a large industrial building sited in an environmentally sensitive area. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Smith. Almost perfectly on time. Councillor Walmsley is next for the Parish Council. Hope I've got your name right. Press the grey button in the middle, sir.
And good evening. Gypsos is an agricultural farm, but if this application is granted, it will become a commercial business. Currently, it is the registered address of MW International, which has the following subsidiaries listed: MW Agri, MW Training, MW Equestrian, and MW Recycling. We have estimated that just on the storage of hay, as described in the original application, I know it's a reduced application now, but in the original application, there would be 800 commercial lorry movements per year. The agriculture exemption should not be applied to what is in effect will become a transit depot. Access is limited to the narrow lane running up from the Ham Lane A20 junction in Blenheim, with a sharp 90-degree bend on the Pilgrim's Way trackway. The Pilgrim's Way trackway has tarmac at this point, but is still a narrow trackway with grass growing up the middle. It is also, of course, part of the long-distance trackway from Winchester to Canterbury and is well used. Over Easter, there would be young walkers walking to the youth service at Canterbury Cathedral. Additional vehicular traffic should not be encouraged, especially heavy lorries that will break up the roadway and verges. A further issue is that the barns will be on the scarp slope of the ANOB, and as such will not be able to be screened from the trackway itself. No doubt the Marley Industrial Complex to the south of the Pilgrim's Way at this point has been mentioned in mitigation. Please note that the Marley site is not on the ANOB. It's on flatter ground and is well screened from the Pilgrim's Way. Marley does not use the Pilgrim's Way for access. The access that is there is locked except in cases of emergency. I think it's worth noting that if the Marley planning application was being made today rather than in the 1920s, you would have turned it down. Having the Marley site there is not an excuse to extend the industrial area into the ANOB. Given what I've said, obviously, Blenheim Parish Council is asking that this application is refused. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr Tamset for the applicant, please.
Good evening. I would like to start by addressing a few concerns raised by the objectors. It is illogical to submit 8 separate applications. In fact, 8 separate applications have been submitted rather than 1 due to a flaw in the planning fee structure. The cost of this type of planning application is determined by overall area of development. 1 application would have cost £15,780. 8 separate ones cost £640. A saving of £15,140. That's not illogical. It has been mentioned that 800 commercial lorry movements per year will result from the overall 8-barn development. There will be no more significant traffic movements than currently exist. The only additional traffic movement the 8 barns would have created would come from the additional land the applicant was hoping to take the option on, that of the 120 acres. The applicant currently must go from Gibbs Farm to the various fields and store the hay in the rented barns, and then bring the hay back to Gibbs Farm before selling it on. There will be less vehicle movements if the hay was brought straight back to Gibbs Farm. The loss of the barns that the applicant no longer rent will result in having to bring all the hay back to Gibbs Farm, with a considerable number of bales having to be stored in the open air. This results in significant loss of hay and its quality, and also creates financial loss. The applicant cannot erect barns on other sites as he does not own any additional land. The land he harvests as long-term renting contracts. The trackway has been cited as having no suitable passing places. In the 700 metres distance from the main A20, there are 3 passing places that the applicant currently uses on a regular basis. There are no objections to say that there is no justification for having all 8 barns. Mr. Richard Lloyd Hughes, the Agriculture Advisor to Mason Borough Council, in his assessment as an agricultural expert, has stated, "I consider there is a justifiable agricultural requirement for the proposed additional barn storage so that Gips Oast can function efficiently as the applicant's operating farming and contracting base." Now, policy DM36 of the local plan sets out that the MPPF lends strong support to the rural economy and seeks to promote agricultural and land-based rural businesses. Refusal to allow this development is therefore contrary to the fundamental principles of the MPPF and local plan. I note the landscape officer concedes that the site already has some level of screening, and further screening would be conditioned to limit the visual impact from the wider area. The officer also concedes that in relation to land at Gips Oast, the proposed location in the southeast corner, close to an existing axis at the bottom of the slope, would minimise views and harm from the surrounding countryside. I'm somewhat surprised that the officer has failed to mention the vast complex of industrial buildings at Marley Works, immediately to the south of the site, which also act as a visual screen. When viewed from the top of the scarp to the north, the only view lost by the development will be that of the Marley Works. The refusal of 6 of the 8 barns jeopardises the farming enterprise. Refusal of these 2 barns will devastate the applicant's farming business and totally contrary to the fundamental principles laid out in the policy of the MPF.
Almost exactly on time, sir. Right, Councillor Mrs Sams.
Thank you, councillors. There's an acceptance in the report that planning permission would result in some landscape harm to the countryside. We've all agreed with that. This is not only a site that's on the AONB, it's of high sensitivity, and this has landscape guidance of conserve. This is an application to which the Ramblers object, CPRE objects, the Kent Down OAMB object. It will affect Grade 2 listed building. I'm surprised that the officer is recommending permission when our own NBC landscape report, which is in the committee report, states that the proposal would appear out of character with the surrounding landscape. The location is not directly associated with existing farm buildings. The proposed site layout does not accord with the landscape guidelines, and the applicant has not submitted landscape and visual appraisal assessing the full effects of the proposed development in landscape terms. So we're talking about quite a harmful application. We've talked about the road. It is very narrow, it is very muddy, there are very few passing places. Indeed, a vehicle would have to reverse, and I do it frequently. They're about 1/3 of a mile one way and 1/4 of a mile the other way, and that's in a car. Obviously, with a bigger vehicle, that is much more difficult. Just going on to policy DM36, there's various things in that policy. The proposal saying the proposal is reasonably necessary for the purpose of agricultural. I don't think that it is. The proposals do not seem necessary for the purpose of agriculture. It could be in other areas. The policy says the proposal would not have an adverse impact on the immunity of existing residents. It does. The policy says that if it's in an isolated location is essential, then the site should be chosen to minimise the visual impact of the building or structure on the character and appearance of the countryside. It doesn't do that. The impact of this application is huge, and I believe it flies in the face of those policies and contravenes policies. And I would ask that on all these points that I've made and others have made, that the application is refused. Thank you, Councillor.
Thank you, Councillor. Mrs Sams. All right, I don't think we have a ward member here. I keep looking at Councillor Powell and thinking he's the ward member, and I realise he only lives in the area. So I'm going to go to Councillor Prendergast, who I think was the first to indicate.
Thank you, Chairman. I must confess to feeling slightly horrified when I first read the committee report on this, but I did walk in here with an open mind, and one or two of the concerns that I had have been addressed and certainly by the urgent update. But I still have concerns about this, and I'm just looking at the appraisals and key issues here, and looking at the principles of development, and I know SP17 and DM36 both support this type of development where it's considered to be reasonably necessary. But I'm finding it very difficult, as far as SP17 goes, to see how the landscape harm... Mr Hill, would you mind going back to that slide with the planning notices, please? The 6 or 8 planning notices. Wonderful. I think that says it all, really. So what we don't have is an assessment of the harm to the AONB or any mitigation that's proposed currently. I can't see anything in the papers or the planning portal. We've got... I'm not going to call it an objection from our own landscape officer, but it's certainly quite strong in the level of protection we should be offering in the AONB. We've got objections from the AONB unit and the management plan for the AONB, which we support as part of our own policies here. So I really, given the previous refusal, I would have expected to have seen some sort of landscape and visual impact assessment and a mitigation strategy. DM36, yes, DM36 supports this type of development, but it supports it, reading it, it supports it within the site. And what we're looking at here is not hay coming from this site itself, it's being transported from other areas. I think I'm correct in understanding that this type of development in any other area would benefit from permitted development rights. So why hasn't the option of looking at building such storage barns within the areas where the hay is being grown, why has that not been considered? Because it certainly would not be allowed in the AONB. Agricultural need, again, I think I've addressed that with the last comment that I've made. I can't actually understand why the storage of machinery is related to the agricultural and equestrian business is part of this application. It's, in my mind, it's a completely separate business, a separate matter, and should be part of a separate application. Just one point, the comments from rural planning, I know that you've praised them in this report, but they're not showing on the planning portal, and it would have been good to have seen the full report. Sustainability, we come back to that. Highways, I think Councillor Sams and Councillor Walmsley put their case extremely well. I really cannot believe that Kent Highways have actually agreed to this. I am horrified because normally they would object massively to any housing development of this sort, and I will certainly be taking it up with the Cabinet member when I'm next there. The ecological element, yes, it's now been addressed in the conditions that an assessment will be required. But again, I am concerned that this hasn't been supplied in advance because Mr. Bailey will tell you that in recent weeks we have experienced a very large agricultural building of this type going up without submitting a pre-commencement mitigation strategy for Newt. So, we've already had our fingers burnt in that area, and this is something we should have insisted on. Heritage. I'm near coming to the end now. Heritage. We've got case law that says quite clearly that any harm to the setting of heritage assets requires the most compelling justification, and I cannot accept that these two barns sitting side by side and 150 metres from a Grade 2 listed building will not have an impact on the setting of that building, and really that is something else that should have had more consideration, or at least a comment from our conservation officer. And again, Mr. Smith, I had made a note about the footpaths. It's the AONB The local economy, the economy of Lenham, depends on the tourist trade, and we've just completely failed to take any notice of the impacts of this development. And as far as I can see, the refusal for the previous applications applies equally to these two. So on that basis, I would like to move, please, because I've really not heard anything tonight to allay these concerns. I would like to move that we refuse these applications on the same basis as we have previously.
Okay, I'm glad you added that last sentence, Councillor Prendergast. I wasn't going to come in yet, but given that you put it like that, I think it is important to direct members' attention to this particular grounds that were used in the previous refusal. And you will note that they are focused on the landscape issues, and without trying to be too dogmatic about this, the issue does seem to me, and I think the officers are likely to agree, to be an issue of weighing the policy in the landscape terms. I think it's very hard to argue, given some of the statements that are made here, that and the fact that the previous refusal did not go down that path, that we can get into the highway and the conservation grounds, because it would be, there is an issue of consistency in planning decision making, I think. But if members were so minded, I think you can make the argument on the landscape grounds, and add to that that within the terms of the policy we have, it actually says that it needs to be reasonably clear that an isolated location like this, in other words, not against the context of a set of buildings, has to be essentially justified as the location that is necessary. Well, members could argue, I think, that that even if there is a reasonable agricultural need, the need to put the development in this particular isolated location has not been demonstrated. So I'm just trying to help you there, Councillor.
No, thank you for your help, Chairman, but I do understand what you're saying, and I do understand what you're saying about consistency, but we also look at each application on its own merits, and I am concerned on other matters. But I will take your advice, and I will take the advice of officers. Thank you.
We can return to that issue later if members wish to pursue it. Councillor Harwood, yes, I see you. Councillor Harwood had already indicated some time ago, and Councillor Powell is next for the avoidance of doubt, and then you, Councillor Mumford. And
right, thank you, Chairman. There's quite a long reference to some of my input in the urgent update, so I won't go over that ground. But I think it's useful because it actually means that there are some changes to the recommendation that actually now make the recommendations policy compliant in terms of the landscape character assessment guidance around the buffers. However, I think the basis of this application is around the economics of hay. I mean, bizarrely, because hay, as is mentioned in the urgent update, is a very low-value product. It's £1.50 to £2 maximum for a square bale, £20 to £30 if you're lucky for a big round bale. Therefore, you need to operate a lot of satellite sites to cut enough hay to get it to a point where there's a economic viability there. So there will always be this kind of network involved with a central point. The machinery required for hay, for cutting, for baling, the tractors, the trailers, and so on, again, is expensive. So the whole viability around hay and haylage is quite kind of borderline. So I have got some kind of, I think that needs to be taken into account, because the alternative, if we see fields going out of a lay use, going out of hay, is that we get either very intensive high input arable, or we lose that land from agriculture. So I think there is a bigger picture that we need to understand around the economics and around that type of management, which, if we don't want to see our rural landscape change to become all polytunnels, we need to consider this point. Therefore, I actually think that with the revised conditions around the landscaping so that it follows Pilgrim's Way and Flint Lane, so that southern and eastern edge, I think that goes a long way to undoing the landscape damage which will occur from putting utilitarian buildings into a protected landscape. I also applaud the fact that the landscaping is now to be to the north and west is to be drawn tighter to the buildings. However, I think in a case such as this, usually a landscaping condition will only pertain for about 5 years, usually, is on our condition. And after 5 years, it can be grubbed out. What we do not want is to get a really decent landscaping scheme growing up around these very large barns, and then they disappear after 5 years, as happens on most sites that we permit, whether it be for housing or whatever. So therefore, I think the way that we address that is that it will have to be separate to this planning application, is that we perhaps approve this planning application with the revised conditions, but then we seek a TPO on the new planting, the landscape buffers, once they're in, and we can therefore ensure that that landscaping will survive to screen the buildings. And I think then we will actually see a landscape benefit in bringing back the hedges and the shores and so on, which were only lost from this landscape 20 years ago. I mean, this was not this very, very open landscape. Well, perhaps 30 years ago, there were hedgerows on it, there were woodland shores on it, and it was a lot damper. I remember when there were lapwings and all sorts around here. So I think we can start to undo some of that landscape damage through this application and also make the economics of the hay business work. So I think it's a kind of win-win. So therefore, I don't think anybody seconded Councillor Prendergast's motion. I would like to move that we do grant permission as per the urgent update papers, and that later on we talk about how we move to gain the tree preservation order on the new landscaping scheme. Thank you.
I will come to that in a moment. Councillor Prendergast, I wasn't going to actually take a formal motion at this stage, but as we've moved to that stage, I think we're going to have to. Would you like to refine your terms of refusal, and then we'll see whether it's seconded?
Okay, well, I wrote down all the policies, but I will have a...
Well, if you could refer to the...
If you refer to the urgent update, the original one, yeah, I think that might help you.
Previously not seen.
Sorry, the previously not seen one, sorry. Planning, have you got this, Councillor Prendergast? Yeah. I think I'll have to read it now. Oh, that's good. Can we also, if that were going down the line, would officers like to comment on whether it is reasonable or not to actually refer to the need for the isolated location not having been clearly demonstrated?
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Chairman. In terms of the isolated location, policy DM36 sort of covers that in terms of the assessment. So as part of any sort of refusal, that would be picked up in that section. In terms of the heritage impact, and obviously we've made an assessment that in terms of relation to the listed building, these actual buildings, in terms of, if we go back to, so I'll just go to this, we're looking at this building here. We've refused these applications here, but we didn't refuse them on the basis of their impact on the setting of the listed building at Marley Court. This sits at slightly lower ground, and whilst in terms of its wider setting, I think if with what we were proposing, the mitigation, it could be mitigated by the sort of additional landscaping, which would, to my mind, would have overcome and sort of address that impact. But that, I mean, in terms of that, we haven't got a specific comments from a conservation officer, because in terms of this one, the distance between it's not affecting the actual listed building itself in terms of works to it. There is some gap between it. There is some sort of landscaping as well intervening, and we felt that actually that harm wouldn't be so harmful to justify a refusal.
I mean, you've heard the officer's advice, and historically, putting in slightly weak grounds just tends to undermine the others. Do I see a seconder for the amendment? Councillor Hastie, you were marginally first. Do you wish to speak or reserve your right? You're reserving your right. Thank you. Right. Councillor Harwood has moved an amendment. So before we proceed any further, Councillor Harwood, would you like to clarify your amendment?
That we grant permission as per the papers and the urgent update, and that once we have made the decision on the application on the papers, we then move to agree that a tree preservation order be placed on the newly planted landscape buffers subsequent to their introduction.
Is that seconded? Councillor Willis, do you wish to speak or reserve your right? Reserve your right. Okay. Right, we proceed with the debate. Councillor Powell.
Yeah, sorry, Councillor Willis beat me to it, then I was going to second it. It doesn't matter, I'm not going to fight over it. But the first question is, I'd like to know where Councillor Harwood gets his bales of hay at £1.50 from, but that's probably totally irrelevant.
I'm sure he can tell you later.
Yeah. Just moving on to this application, I mean, the applicant, in mind, it's been mentioned this evening about various kind of stabling and horses, etc. But the majority of the people that live in the area, they will know that he's one of the top show jumpers in the country, and therefore requires that facility. And only a couple of years ago, I spoke to the applicant on behalf of my daughter, that's also in the show jumping sort of, probably not at that sort of level, although she thinks she is at times, but that's just to ask how he supports what he does, because normally it's an extremely kind of wealthy parent. It's a bit like motor racing, where there's money behind it. And the answer that was given at that time was, we're starting to buy straw and hay, cut people's fields and sell it from a barn that we've got in effect in their garden, a very nice garden. Moving on to this application, is all I can see is that particular business has become more successful. So as a council, and looking at everything that's in DM 36 on the local plan and what it stands for, is how do we actually support successful kind of rural businesses? Yes, I know the setting is on the AONB, but I tell you what, I can find a lot of housing estates that are built within the setting of the AONB that are far worse than what this would be, and not too far from where this actual applicant is. So on the balance, I would like to see us, well, I'm obviously I'd say approve, I mean, but I will certainly be kind of supporting Councillor Harwood in his motion, because I think we ought to stick up for people in the rural economy, give people a chance, and if we can help people or individuals or companies grow, then I think that we should. So that's my two penneth.
Thank you, Councillor Powell. Councillor Mumford.
I always write down what the objectors say, but the overriding factor here for me is 5.01, where our rural planning advisor has said there is a need. A transport depot, I'm pretty sure that the rural advisor wouldn't have said what he said there on the need if it was going to be turned into a transport depot. It is storage of hay and machinery. And I think it's quite common for farmers to lease land. In fact, nowadays they have to lease land. And it is quite normal. And this is a rural economy, and this is the way it works. I was pleased to see Councillor Harwood's comments where now the landscaping has been drawn right back into the buildings. One thing that we have done in the past, and the proposer and seconder might consider doubling the 5 years. We have put 10 years on that in the past, and then go for the TPO. But I will support the rural economy. Tonight we're looking at taking away one barn from the rural economy and adding two. And we should not be going backwards. This farmer needs to farm, and therefore he needs to store his hay, he needs to store his machinery, or do we just lose our landscape? And we need this type of farming and not intensive growing of crops under the tunnels that we see. And I'm for this, and I'm for the amendment.
Thank you very much, Councillor Mumford. You indicating, Councillor Mortimer?
Thank you, Chairman. Well, I'm sorry, I've got to go for refusal on this, but I'd like to say, first of all, as a council, we do support our rural people. The economy there, we want to support them. The thing about this, we have exemptions from policy for our local farmers. And the thing is, if you've got a parcel of land and you want to put an agricultural building on there, and you own that land, you live there, and you farm that land, we have exemptions. They probably don't even plan permission. What we're talking about is putting buildings up that's going to be supplied from other land that is rented. Now, we won't go into this evening, but our legal man knows full well that we are at this moment in time having an investigation in case law solely on this subject, so we can't comment on it because we haven't got a result on it. But I would say that, yes, we do support our rural economy, but I'm afraid this is it's not owned land that this is going to be used for. So I'm sorry, on that alone I would refuse it. I'm very surprised with no comment again from highways, I have to say that, but hey, that's that highways, we can't go down that route. So I will support you, and I would like, if that motion was to include that, if you didn't already, in your reasons for refusal. Pardon? What I've just said, that this does not come under our policy for exemption under the agricultural exemption, because it's not being used on land owned by... yes, it can be done, Chairman. I know it can. Thank you.
I don't believe that actually is a planning ground as such, but that needs to be added because it's sort of already covered, but in the grounds for refusal already set out. Okay. Well, if it's a matter of emphasis, we'll look into that and see whether it's felt needed to be stressed any further. But I think it is covered by but we shall see in a minute. On the highway grounds, well, you know where we are with Kent Highways, traditionally, don't you, Councillor Mortimer? Councillor Bolton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I actually came in this meeting very confused about this application because I couldn't quite see where the officer recommendations come from. Reading the urgent update has clarified that to an extent. But ultimately, Mr. Chair, I do think we are making slightly heavy weather of this, if I'm totally honest, because the reality is what we're actually judging is there's only one possible ground of refusal, as far as I can see, and that's the one that's been given to the other six buildings here. So it's kind of irrelevant us talking about anything else. And what I'm judging is whether the revised sort of landscaping scheme, as is in the urgent update, is enough to overcome the harm that has been caused and that 2 days ago we found had been caused in to the other six buildings. And the reality is, I take the view that if you are to beef up, so to speak, your landscaping scheme, is that enough to overcome the policy issues that Councillor Mortimer has just highlighted? And in my view, I come to the conclusion that I don't think it is, actually, on this occasion. And it's very, very simple for me. It's that simple. I don't think we're in a position as council, I don't think we should be in a position as a council to go, well, actually, if you tighten up the landscape and if you include north, south, east and west, that's enough for us to overturn what a decision we've made 2 days ago on 6 potential buildings just to the side of it. So I'm afraid, Mr Chairman, the urgent update has very much clarified my thought process in this, and it's for that reason alone, and that is the only reason alone, but it's obviously a very big one, I'll be supporting Councillor Prendergast tonight.
Can I just ask Mr Bailey to clarify this issue of exemptions and land ownership, because as far as I'm aware, the ownership of the land does not affect it. But Mr Bailey.
No, I mean, I would occur with that. I mean, obviously, the land ownership issues, you could not own the land, you could rent the land and still put agricultural buildings on the land. I mean, you just notify the landowners. So, you know, that's not going to stop you erecting a building on that site. If you want to erect a building on that site, you're putting a lot of investment into that site. Most people don't do it unless they've got a long-term lease on the land. And barns have a longevity to them, but as I said, that shouldn't stop and wouldn't make any difference in terms of your decision-making. Could I just, while I have one further point, that if, in terms of the ground of refusal, if you are going to go around that route, if I could take you to 6.20, and I think it is important because obviously recent case law dictates that you must give good reasons, again, why you're going against the officer recommendation. If you consider that this sort of puts it on the basis that the visual harm of the two plots is considered to be outweighed by the agricultural economic benefits, you could turn that around, that if you were going to refuse it, that the visual harm is not. The visual harm to the landscape is considered too great by the arising from the economic benefits. So just turn it around the other way, and that gives you a reason of why you're doing that reason. Because you know, I just adding that particular point.
I think that's sensible. Councillor Mortimer, quickly, you wanted to come back.
Pursue that matter, but I would just like to say that our legal people have not said exactly what Mr Bailey has said. They are investigating that particular cause that I was talking about because they are not sure of it, and there is case law to prove what I said, but it's got to come out in the wash. Tonight we haven't got the information, so I'll take on board what Mr Bailey says. Thank you.
Okay, well, we've rehearsed the arguments quite clearly one way or the other. The amendment is to be voted on first, if you, that is to grant the consent with the urgent update and then to address with a separate motion, which we will talk to in due course, of TPO. May I simply ask whether it has been suggested, Councillor Harwood, that the landscape condition should be longer?
I actually think that if we're placing a TPO on the landscaping once it goes in, it's superfluous because if trees die, they'll need to be replaced under the TPO and vice versa.
One moment. Mr Bailey was asked whether you would wish to have the landscaping put in first if an approval were granted. As effectively.
Well, yeah, I mean, what I would like would be a phasing condition. So potentially, if the landscaping scheme either goes in before or concurrently. However, I am very aware that we are right at the end of the planting season now.
Indeed.
And we might actually hold it up because here on the Scarp of the Downs, if you don't get it in when the ground is getting colder rather than getting warmer, it's just not going to take. So I don't think in this case, the phasing would probably be within at least a year of the scheme starting or something.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Willis, as you did reserve your right, very briefly, is it germane to the amendment? Okay, your question's been answered. Thank you. Right. Those in favour of the amendment that has been proposed and seconded to grant with the urgent update, bearing in mind that there will be a second motion later if it is granted. Those in favour of that amendment, please indicate. Those against? Hang on, can we take that again? I made it 7.
Can we get hands up in the air? Sorry. Yeah. Just to make sure.
Yeah, correct, 7, not 6. Right, that amendment falls. We move to the substantive motion, which is to refuse on the grounds which comprehensively set out, and I think which everyone is now aware of. If not, ask your question now. Right, fine. Those in favour... Sorry, hang on.
And the reversal of that.
Yes, well, that is taking into account the reversal of the emphasis in the report. In other words, notwithstanding the economic benefit, is considered that the specific landscape harm of this proposal outweighs the economic benefit. Those in favour of that substantive motion? Yes, substantive to refuse. Those against? Abstentions? Right, that application is refused for the grounds set out.
Can I dissent noted from that decision,
of course
please?
You can have your dissent noted, Councillor Harwood. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we move on to the second application in this area. Without in any way wanting to truncate debate, I would urge members of the public and individuals not to repeat word for word what they've already said. And that goes for officers too.
So, just in terms of the presentation is actually the same in terms of the photographs, the plans. The only thing which is different is that, just for clarification, plot 8 is the one closest to the junction. So it's one at the bottom here. I don't really wish to say anything more on that, if that's okay with you, Chair.
It's fine. I mean, it is essentially the same, almost the same proposal. Councillor Bolton, you were looking agitated.
Well, I was going to say, bearing in mind this is in effect exactly the same conversation we've just had and the decision that we've just taken, I would happily move right now that we refuse this application on the same grounds that we have just refused the last one.
Whilst I understand what you're saying, we cannot do that. Each planning application must be legally determined on its merits. Now, the debate may be shortened because we are, for lack to rule out repetition and all that, but what we cannot do legally is proceed straight to a vote without me at least asking the speakers this evening whether they wish to say anything further, because they have registered to speak on the second application. So, let me start. Mr. Smith, would you wish to add anything to your to your comments earlier, specifically on this application?
I don't think so. My objection is to this being exactly the same as well.
Okay, I take that as a no. Thank you. I just want a yes or no, and not. Councillor Walmsley, do you wish to add anything? Yes, come forward to the table, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have just one thing to add, and that's perhaps in part answer to Councillor Harwood. From memory, the Marley site is screened by 3 rows of trees, overlapping, such that it's impossible to see through. If you do go ahead with this particular barn, I would like to see something similar. But I don't know, even then, because we are starting to go up the scarp slope, that it would actually make any difference. I still think you would be able to see the top of the barn. But, yes, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. That is useful. Mr. Tamset, did you wish to add anything at this point?
Yeah, I just would like to add that we did go down the pre-application route with Maidstone Borough Council. They did agree that that was the optimum site for the buildings to go on. It's at the lowest point of the scarp. It can be well screened. One of the reasons we didn't do a landscaping scheme was on the advice of Maidstone Borough Council that actually it's already well screened, providing we put infilling in an additional, that would be fine, and we agreed that we expected a condition for a landscaping scheme to be put forward. So basically, we have gone down the route of pre-application. We have been advised that this is fine, that the applicant has no further land, so it's no good saying, oh, put a barn somewhere else. You can't just put a barn somewhere else if you don't own the land. Part of the farming is on this land, so some of the hay will be coming from this land. None of these buildings were anticipated to be used for equine use. That has already been taken up with the existing buildings there. So this is a loss to the farming community. There we go.
Thank you, Mr Thames. Councillor Mrs Sams, did you wish to take that as a no? Thank you very much. Right. Councillor Harwood.
Thank you, Chairman. In light of what I think is a very foolish decision that was just made on the previous application, I think if we are not to destroy this agricultural business and do wider damage to the Kent countryside, we must permit this scheme. So I would therefore grant and move that we grant permission as per the papers and that we have a separate a condition or a separate motion in relation to the landscaping. But anybody who knows this site knows that this corner next to Flint Lane is in a hollow, is hidden, and if people were kind of looking at that gateway they were before and then looking at the Scarp Slope, we're now talking considerably to the east and the corner with Flint Lane, and it is heavily concealed by existing landscaping. So I would want to put a lifeline out for this agricultural business that there will not be landscape harm from this application.
Thank you, Councillor Harwood. Before we proceed any further, Mr Bailey, consistency is always an issue. Is Councillor Harwood right in saying that it would be possible to draw a distinction in landscape terms between this application and the last one? Because that's a nub of it. Because if there isn't, we risk undermining this committee's previous decision.
I mean, clearly each application has to be determined on its own individual merits. If you were minded to approve this application and refuse, and you had resolved to refuse the other application, you'd be clearly looking at where the consistency sits. Councillor Harwood has articulated to a degree that he considers that in this particular part, because it's located further to the south and tucked into the corner, that could be a justification as to why you consider that this barn is more acceptable than the previous one. Personally, you have to come up with very convincing arguments that actually that this one by its own is so well shielded, why this one is so different from the other scheme. But Councillor Harwood has articulated, and that's what I'd advocate, that's what members would have to do if they were going to say, why is this one acceptable and the other one is not. It might be a more difficult argument to sustain. I mean, we've clearly said in the application and treated them both that there is visual harm arising from both applications on the countryside. So we've set that out in the report already that there is harm arising. 620 summarises that overall. So if you're asking me personally, it might be more difficult to argue, but Councillor Harwood has gone down the right route of articulating specifically why this one specifically might be acceptable. And my advice is you would have to do that in order to go down an approval route on this.
Thank you, Mr Bailey. That's quite clear. Is Councillor Harwood's motion, as it is at this stage, seconded? Councillor Mumford was marginally ahead, I think.
Councillor Harwood knows the location better than me, and if it does dip down there, I accept that, and that would be our reason. We'd be able to bring the landscaping in, but the point is about the business, and the Rural Planning Advisor says there is a need. So if we don't do this, then we're acting against the rural economy yet again. And last time this was mentioned, Councillor Harwood nearly got laughed out of here. But for all those people that are now preventing hay being grown, have a look at arable and have a look at the effect on air quality, because that's what you're doing. You're going over to arable and it has a massive effect on air quality. It does.
Well, yes, I do think it might be a bit short-sighted, but and we might end up regretting the consequences of our actions, but that remains to be seen. Councillor Bolton, I think you indicated.
I did. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for exactly the same reasons that I mentioned earlier in discussing the last application when, and I can't speak for others, but I came to the view myself based on the decision about the 6 other buildings as to why I felt that the 7th building, for want of a better word, better phrase really, should be refused. I take the same view for the matter of consistency on this 8th building now. I mean, the report we've got in front of us is in effect wiped out by the decision we've just made, and having travelled past the sites as well on my way here when the report came out, I don't think that the slight alteration in the land is enough to, again, go against the decision that we've just made 5 minutes ago, to be honest, Mr. Chairman. So, for that reason, as I said earlier, I will happily move an amendment to Councillor Harwood's motion that for exactly the same grounds as the previous application, we refuse this application.
Is that seconded? Councillor Prendergast, if you'd like to briefly speak to that, I will come back to you.
And I don't have anything to add. Thank you.
Councillor Willis, you are indicating.
I don't really like arguing against this because Councillor Sams is one of my favourite councillors, but but I'm a bit of an urbanite, and what I don't really understand. We're arguing against building a barn, okay, a modern barn, on the edge of an urban escarpment, on the edge of an AONB. I understand that. I can see clearly on the map. But we're arguing against that. Is one of the reasons we're arguing against it because this would lead to further similar likely applications and buildings that this could lead to that and a change to the landscape?
I would hope not, Councillor, because every application should be determined on its merits.
But can I ask, does that create a case for the next application further along to be more likely because it has similar?
Yeah. No, we have.
Can I ask the officer?
Okay, fine, but the answer is no.
Yeah, I mean, each application is judged on its merits. I mean, that's sort of a thing we always trot out, and in terms of this, it's no different. I mean, obviously, we've just refused 7 applications in immediate vicinities. I think that's quite clearly, this isn't going to set a precedent if you did approve it, because there's 7, we've refused 7 immediately around it because of the greater harm to their own base.
Councillor Powell.
I think it is a separate application, actually. I think it's a lot closer to the to the road. And from what I can remember, somebody mentioned earlier on, is we're removing 1 and we're looking for 2. Well, we've already got rid of 1, so isn't it 1 for 1? I might have misheard that. But anyway, I mean, for what I would always say is the people that know this particular site would have a completely different view to the people that haven't visited this site. And there's lots of conversations happening tonight, and from the conversations I've heard, those people haven't visited or understand this site at all. And I sometimes think it's wrong that people should actually give such a firm judgment, let alone proposing that we reject it when they don't even know the place. But anyway, that's me on my high horse there. I'm inclined to agree with what the parish council have said tonight. As long as you've got the screening right and the AONB is protected, what's the problem?
Right, members. Unless anyone has anything dramatically new to add, I am going to proceed to the vote on this. I think the arguments for whether or not this is a distinctive enough proposal have been made or not. Positions have been taken, so I'm going to move to the amendment on this occasion, which is to refuse for the grounds set out. Those in favour of the amendment at this stage, please indicate. That's to refuse, yes. 7, those against. Right, that amendment is passed and becomes the substantive motion. So we vote again. Those in favour of refusing the application, please indicate.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.
Those against?
1, 2, 3, 4.
I'm not sure whether Councillor Willis is voting or not, so it's 5. Thank you very much. That application is refused for the grounds set out.
Can I have my dissent noted again, please, Chairman?
Of course, Councillor Harwood. All right, we now proceed to item 3, item 13, which is the third in a list of planning applications, which is on page 9. You previously indicated, Councillor Prendergast, that you wish to have this item introduced. Is that still the case? It's item Orchard Place, Chartway Street, Sutton Valence. Okay, in that case...
I will need to request members an update on something, an amendment to a motion.
Yeah, just do that.
Members, if we're not going to present it, if I could request just an update. On page 14, condition 1, obviously, if that condition were to stand, it could allow the mobile structure and 1 caravan and 1 tourer to be positioned on that site. So I would request that that be amended to say no more than 1 mobile structure and 1 touring caravan should be stationed on the application site at any time. You've also got the caveat to section 4, condition 4, which says should that be removed, it should be replaced within a caravan within the definition, because obviously this is not a caravan by definition, it is a mobile structure. If I could just ask for that amendment, please.
I'm sure members will agree to that. Eminently sensible. That's agreed. Thank you. In that case, move the recommendation on the papers with the amendment to the conditions. Of those in favour? Sorry, Councillor Bolton is seconding, I believe. Those in favour?
4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
Those against? 1. Abstentions? 1. Right, members, we now move to the excitement of the evening, when probably what would be the most controversial application a lot, which is item 16. And Councillor Prendergast, having declared an interest, will be leaving us at this point. I don't think it's controversial at all. But which won't have time, I don't think. All joking aside, members, this is not a particularly controversial application, and there are no speakers, so unless anyone wants to... Councillor Harwood does. In that case, would you like to introduce it?
Thank you, Chair. This is a prior notification for change of use in an agricultural building to 1 dwelling and for its association operational development under Schedule 2, Part 3, Class Q, A and B of the General Permitted Development Order 2015 as amended. Just draw members' attention to items raised on the previously seen urgent update, which had 3 additional representations and some comments in terms of raised from the Parish Council regarding Class Q, an individual within who is a member of the Parish Council but represented on an individual basis, and it's set out clearly in terms of where the concerns from that individual lie, in the sense that he doesn't consider it complies with Class Q. I think the officer addresses that particular point in that urgent update report. The presentation's not going to be long, you're glad to hear, because the issues on Class Q are in fact facts and degree. There are a number of matters that you're being asked to consider. The first point, does it constitute a prior approval? The officer sets that out in the report that it does constitute that on a prior approval, with it meeting the key dates as set out in the GPDO. Then what you're then asked to consider are the matters under paragraphs 2.82A to E in terms of its prior approval required under those bases. So those matters are addressed out in the report. You're also considering the external appearance of the building, and maybe I should go to the presentation very quickly here. You've got an aerial, this is the site, public footpath going through the site, and the building in question is this building here with the main house over here. And then this is the state of the building, so I'll just go through. One of the key issues you're looking at is structural integrity. You'll see that this is a concrete post and frame building. So in terms of its structural integrity, there is no doubt that it could be converted and it can take the weight and the loadings that will be associated with its conversion. So those are the key points that it meets. Is it or was it in agricultural use on the day on those particular points in question that's set out in the report, and your officer addresses that matter in the report. So just going through very briefly, you'll see it is of sound construction. Well, I'm only going through those very quickly. You've got the existing building here, and you've got the proposed conversion. So it meets all the criteria and the limitations imposed by Class Q, and therefore, on the basis, the officer concludes that the proposal does fall within the prior approval process, and obviously recommends that prior approval be granted, subject to the condition which is a preliminary risk assessment contamination that we normally impose on agricultural buildings. And as such, it's recommended for approval. Thank you.
Right. Do you take any declarations of lobbying on this? Councillor Round. And Councillor Round, as you are the ward member, do you wish to say anything at this point?
Thank you, Chair. On the basis that I am the ward member and I have very little more to say because it's already been said, I'd suggest we move straight to the vote.
I do apologise, Mr. Prendergast. I didn't call you. It's my fault. Would you like to come forward? It's my fault. Hope not.
Good evening. As members will be aware, this application is for a permitted development under Class Q of the General Permitted Development Order 2015. This legislation is one that is criteria-based, and the determination of the application does not require the balancing or judgment-based exercise of normal planning applications. The necessary requirements have been covered by your officer in both the main report and the urgent update, and the officer is satisfied by the information provided to recommend approval for the application. However, as 3 representations have been made to the Planning Committee on matters outside of the scope of this application, nevertheless I will address any concerns that members may have on the key issues. Great Crested Newts. The neighbouring landowner has asked that an ecological assessment should accompany this application. This landowner's own application for a large development contained a Great Crested Newt survey which showed that the pond in question has no potential to support Great Crested Newts. And this assessment was recently accepted by the Kent County Council ecologist and this committee. And there is no reason to think otherwise for this application. Land not in agricultural use. This change is entirely without substance, as evidenced by the urgent update. It's a pity this person did not spend a few minutes looking at Google Earth. Vehicular access. Peckham Farm shares a driveway with a neighbouring property and has, according to the deeds lodged with the land registry, and I quote, a right-of-way for all purposes and at all times, with or without vehicles and animals, over the farm track between the points marked A, from the highway, and B, access to the field belonging to Peckham Farm. in favour of the owners or occupiers of the adjoining or neighbouring properties or over the land hereby transferred. End of quote. No other highways objections have been raised by either Kent Highways or your planning department. Contamination risk. Any risk is considered by your officers to be low level and has been addressed via the recommended condition. Having been disadvantaged already by my wife's position on this council, I hope members will not add to this disadvantage by not approving an application which under normal circumstances would have been delegated to your officers and approved. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I apologise for not calling you earlier. It was because you waved your right when you thought it was going to not be introduced. Councillor Round, you started to move a motion before I had to reverse myself. Could you repeat it for...
I would just suggest that we've heard it all. All that needs to be said has been said, so let's go to the vote.
In which way?
In favour.
Is there a second? Councillor Bolton, would you wish to speak or withdraw you? Right. Councillor Harwood.
Right, thank you, Chairman. I've been lobbied on this application from a number of directions, so I just wanted to flag that up. I think one of the key concerns coming up from the locals is the fact that using Class Q, there is an issue here around perhaps some of the scrutiny around, is this building actually worthy of conversion? Is this site now viable as a farm? Well, it's not a farm because the farmland has been sold off from around it. So therefore, I think there was some concerns in terms of process. I have had some discussions prior to this meeting about this all pertains to a point in time. However, I think the big concern is how, this is quite an important landscape. How do we ensure the quality further down the line? And I think what local residents were keen to do was to see a full planning application on this site and not just a permitted development, so that there was some scrutiny and rigour in the process. So in terms of what the next step is, if we do agree to a conversion under the government's new relaxed rules, just for reassurance of the locals, how do we ensure appropriate design, landscaping and all of the other issues which quite rightly they're concerned about?
Mr. Bailey?
In simple answer, as my colleague just inferred, I'm afraid to say, members, we can't. And the government has further extended those rights under the 2018 order and allowed, instead of allowing 3, they've extended it to 5 and increased the size areas that you can have. So what the government is rolling out further, the further ability of landowners with builders in the countryside to allow residential conversion. So I'll go back to the 2 specific questions that were asked. The worthy of conversion and viable use. Obviously, if a building falls within Class Q, that doesn't set out whether it's worthy or whether it's viable. It is, if it's an agricultural building, if it's structurally sound, if it was in agricultural use on the base date, i.e. 2013, then it complies whether it's a worthy building of retention or not, unfortunately. The government's intention was to allow all buildings. Now, I have my own concerns about that because we are allowing some buildings to be converted. But notwithstanding that, the legislation is very clear in what it does allow and what it doesn't allow. If the building is capable of conversion, i.e. structurally sound, if it meets the criteria, then it can be converted, full stop. There's nothing that the planning system can do. You then look at the prior approval under those relevant criteria, 5 criteria, and that's set out in your report quite clearly. What are the elements you consider? That is the only time you can require prior approval. And on this basis, we are requiring prior approval because of potential contamination issues. But then we're going on to say, yes, prior approval is required, but approved, and then opposing a condition on that basis. So, unfortunately, the information you consider is very limited, and that's the government's intention. The government intention is to reuse these buildings And as long as they are converted, that's what they want to see.
And that's very clear. So unless there's any technical questions further, Councillor Harwood, you did indicate you wanted to come back, so briefly.
Thank you, Chairman. Yeah, I understand. I think that this whole prior approval business is a real concern about rural areas. However, I come back to this point that was hammered home to me by the... Maidstone Council has quite a high bar in terms of things like boundary treatments, landscaping, in terms of sustainability of new buildings. I think what the concern here is, what are the parameters? Are the parameters the lowest common denominator? So it's you know, the building regs 2013 is the standard. So we have the potential to get something that does not have the enhancements in terms of materials and the look of the building and the landscaping we would normally expect. I mean, for example, coming back to the landscaping point, presumably there will be no need to landscape it at all. It would not have that condition.
I think Mr Bailey's already explained that, yes, the lowest common denominator is quite literally what the government intended, and that's what it's intended to achieve, and that is what it will achieve in this case. Councillor Mortimer.
Yeah, thank you. I will be supporting approval on this one, having listened, but the one thing about this is it says in here that there is no detailed structural assessment, and it's all on hearsay. So I perhaps would just like to make sure it is structurally sound by having a condition that prior to commencement of this, that they supply a structural assessment, which then will comply with, is it Q? Yeah, class Q. Is that correct, Mr Bailey?
Mr Bailey will answer that.
No, that's not correct. On the basis you can't ask for that. The case law is evolving on this basis, and quite recently at our neighbouring borough, Tunbridge and Morning, had a very interesting High Court case. Clearly you should not be requesting structural surveys in every instance if the building is clearly capable of conversion. Now, if it was a thinly guised steel frame building and you're going to hang a first floor and you're going to hang a new roof and a suspended mezzanine floor, then quite clearly I would question the need of whether that steel frame can structurally take the loading of the building. This one is quite clear in terms of it's pretty solid in terms of its structural integrity. It may need a bit of underpinning on the walls, but that doesn't mean it's not structurally sound. So on that basis, we have to make planning judgments. And, you know, you quite clearly, the judge in the High Court clearly said you should not be asking for structural surveys in every circumstance if it's evidently clear the building is capable of taking the loadings. There's no loadings going really on this building. It's not like going up to another floor. You're not going to put a suspended floor in it. You're not going to be hanging loads of heavy materials off it. It's single story in effect, and the materials, you know, will be standard, that structural column should be able to take those loadings. So on that basis, it wouldn't be reasonable for you to impose that condition, and actually that's something that you'd have to look at the very start of the process, not at this end of the process.
Councillor Mortimer, microphone.
I do thank you for that, and that's spot on. Thank you, James.
Thank you very much. So, Councillor Willis, briefly.
I've got a garage. I'm a bit urban, but I've got a garage. Does that mean I can convert my garage and put my stepchildren in it as a house?
It depends on the circumstances, but permitted development rights do apply in urban areas, but not obviously for agricultural buildings, necessarily. Although you might argue about Famp Farm, whether it's in an urban or a rural location. Unless there are any further deeply important technical questions, I think we have done this one to death. A motion has been moved to approve it and seconded, so we are moving to the vote. Those in favour of granting the consent, however reluctantly. Those against? Right. And of course, there was one member outside of the room. Right. If Councillor Mrs. Prendergast is still there, she can come back, but it's hardly worth it, because all we're going to do is direct opinion notice to appeal decisions on item 17, very briefly. Members will note that with one exception, these are very satisfactory. Do you wish to add anything briefly, Mr Bailey, or particularly on item 4? No. Okay.
Sorry, Chairman.
Yes, Councillor.
I actually think that the King's Cottages defeat appeal is quite an important one, because that is a very prominent building on a very prominent road in the borough, right on the edge of the borough, but it's in because within the metropolitan green belt. We have had some appeal decisions where we lost the appeal, and Chartway Street is a good example, where the scheme that has been built has not been to the usual standards that we would require in terms of things like they've not got solar PV on, they've not got landscaping scheme going in, they've not got the Swift bricks and so on, the things that we usually put on. I understand that if we do lose an appeal, we have a kind of statement of common ground where there is some negotiation as to what the conditions are going to be. If in this case, did we ensure through negotiations that this new dwelling house would be of the kind of standard that we would permit through committee, that it would have those extra elements? Because I'm still concerned as to why the Chartway Street scheme did not, because it is so prominent, and it just seems weird that it did not have the kind of design quality that we would usually demand.
I mean, obviously, you're quite right to say it is a negotiation aspect. We put forward conditions. I can't comment on it this time, so I haven't got the statement with you of the conditions. I don't want to lie to this committee, so I can't confirm that. I can go back and provide that information to you. But we obviously provide a list of conditions when we do our statement. And obviously, the inspector, they have their standard list, and they have to then go through them with the relevant, do they meet the 6 tests scenario? And sometimes, as you're well aware, they knock out quite a lot of the conditions that we oppose, and they say they don't meet the tests and such like. But as I said, in most circumstances, we do put our cases forward for the similar conditions that we oppose at Planning Committee on the basis that's what we're used to working with. It is not in all circumstances the inspectors accept those conditions.
Thank you very much for the explanation. Just briefly on Chairman's announcements, members will remember that this committee made a number of non-planning related recommendations in relation to Brunswick Street and Union Street. The parking side of those are being considered by SBST next week, and the Section 106 Memorandum of Understanding has been progressed through the Audit and Standards and Governance Committee. So just to report that those non-planning issues, but which relate to planning, are being taken forward in other parts of the Council. Does the Vice Chairman want to add anything on any issue? Thank you very much, members and officers, for your contributions, and of course members of the public.